Hey guys, welcome to the College Football Playoff Week 14 rankings rapid reaction. Just going to give my thoughts quickly here on the rankings that were released about an hour ago. A lot of movement with those teams, those SEC teams that lost over the weekend, and then also you have Indiana who fell 5 spots, and then you have Colorado as well who dropped 9 spots from 16 to 25. And as I mentioned in the preview, a huge weekend in terms of positioning for this 12-team playoff. Previously, you were positioning yourself for a conference championship weekend where you were going to win a conference championship and hopefully get into the top four. Now that we have an expanded 12-team playoff, some of these at-large teams, particularly in the 6 to 12 range, won't be playing conference championship games. So you instead, your last game will be the final regular season game, which is this upcoming weekend. So the rankings are particularly important for that. And let's start off at the highest end of the ranking. So Colorado came in at 25, down 9 spots after a big loss to Kansas, losing by 16 on the road in a quasi-neutral site. They played at the Kansas City Chiefs Stadium, but a road loss to Kansas. They're down 9 spots. And just quickly on the Big 12. So the Big 12 is going to have a 4-team tie amongst a bunch of two-loss teams, or excuse me, two-loss within Big 12 teams. It's Colorado, Arizona State, BYU, and Iowa State. Now, the two teams that control their own destiny are Iowa State and Arizona State. So if both those teams win, they'll make it to the Big 12 championship. And then the winner of that will most likely have an automatic bid into the college football playoff. And then there's a little bit of chaos scenario making for Colorado and BYU to hope to maybe get into the conference championship game, but they would need an Arizona State loss and potentially an Iowa State loss. So that's the Big 12. Again, it's just a one-team play. You have to win and you're in, even if you're outside the top 12. The other team I wanted to just quickly mention on the periphery here is Illinois, they were ranked last week in the ranking. They snuck in. Now they're up to 23, so they're benefiting by other teams losing. Illinois is just important because when you look at Penn State's schedule specifically, the knock on Penn State has been that they haven't really played a ranked team in which they won. Of course, they played Ohio State, but this Illinois team now at 23, and we'll see if they move up next week, assuming they win. That team at 23 now creates a top 25 win for Penn State, which will buttress their resume, especially when you compare them to, say, a one-loss Notre Dame. Keeping moving forward here. So Missouri at 21. Missouri just somehow continues to hang around in the top 25 despite having what is a consensus overhyped team and probably overrated team, particularly relative to where the ranking is. So Missouri at 21 going to help out a lot of these SEC resumes for teams that beat Missouri. And then you have A&M at 20. A&M at 20 after that loss to Auburn, down 5 spots in the rankings. If you're an A&M fan, it really just comes down to beating Texas which will get you into the SEC championship game, and then you'll need to beat Georgia to make it. So it's kind of a survive and advance mode for A&M, and everything is still in front of them despite being, I guess there's three. Despite being the seventh ranked team in the SEC. So A&M at 20, that was big time showdown this weekend against Texas. They'll host Texas, 7:30 night game, the first game that these two teams have played since 2011. A lot of bad blood between the two teams. Hopefully we'll have a preview show before Saturday to quickly discuss that matchup. Let's just keep moving forward here. So Tulane at 17. You heard on the College Football Playoff Ranking show the point that Tulane can actually potentially sneak into the playoff, despite Boise being ranked high up in the rankings. So again, it's the the highest 5 ranked conference champions get automatic bids. So if a Tulane team wins their conference championship and they're ranked ahead of the Big 12 conference champion, they would get that spot over, or that automatic qualifier over the Big 12. Now, do I practically think that's going to happen? I don't think so. I think whoever wins the Big 12 out of these 4 teams that are tied, they will likely finish the season ahead of Tulane. But just an interesting scenario to think through. The other thing I would just quickly mention on Tulane is as we start thinking about Tulane potentially moving even further up. Just remember that Tulane has two games against Power 4 teams. Both of those games are losses. They lost to Kansas State, who's ranked 24 right now, and they actually lost to Oklahoma by 2 scores, which, say what you want about Oklahoma and their struggles in the SEC this year and in their first year in the SEC. They beat, a top 20 team in the country. Just keep moving forward. Arizona State rounds out the Big 12 rankings at 16. And then we get to 15, which is really where the logjam starts. So you're going to have 3 teams, all from the SEC, all with 3 losses. You have South Carolina at 15, Ole Miss at 14, Alabama at 13. Ole Miss is down 5 spots after their loss to Florida over the weekend. Alabama down 6 spots after their loss to Oklahoma, in which they got beat pretty handily. Like I said, all 3 of these teams have 3 losses, and it looks like the committee is seeding them within a group. So like we had last week with all of those 2-loss SEC teams in a group of 4, you're going to have these 3-loss SEC teams together. Just worth noting that South Carolina has been really hot as of recently, a really strong team that people think could potentially backdoor their way into the playoff. Just one thing to note, Ole Miss beat South Carolina 27-3 earlier in the year, and Alabama beat South Carolina by 2 earlier in the year. So I think because of that, South Carolina is a little range bound, but there are people that are speculating because South Carolina potentially beat Clemson and then jump ahead of all of these 3-loss SEC teams plus Clemson and potentially vie for that last spot or last at-large spot in the playoff. Like I said, I don't think that that's the right way to think about it. I think, the big positive for South Carolina is they have some of the best losses for a 3-loss team, right? They lost to Ole Miss, they lost to Alabama. These are really quality losses, but it's hard for me to think that, a positive being you have really good losses would help put you ahead of a team that you lost to head to head. So like I said, I think they're range bound. But they will play Clemson, who is now ranked number 12 ahead of Alabama. Clemson up 5 spots in the rankings. So Clemson right now is that first team out in the playoff bracket. Now, I just want to talk quickly about Clemson versus Alabama and Ole Miss. To me, this is a little bit surprising of a ranking, and I think there's a lot of recency here. I think there's a little bit of Clemson getting a benefit because of their brand. So if you look at Clemson, 2-loss team, which compares to Alabama and Ole Miss at 3 losses. Clemson, their 2 losses. One was to Georgia in the first game of the year, lost 34-3. The other loss is to Louisville, in which they really got beaten in that game. The score I think was pretty close, but for practical purposes, Louisville really dominated that game. So, and then when you look at in terms of their ranked wins, they don't really have any. So they'll have a chance to play South Carolina this weekend and get a ranked win if they win. But one thing just to consider is, if we look at common opponent, Clemson played Georgia, was beat pretty significantly by Georgia. Meanwhile, Alabama beat Georgia and Ole Miss beat Georgia. So and both those Alabama beat Georgia by 1 score, and then you have Ole Miss who beat Georgia by 18 points. So that compares to Clemson, who got blown out by Georgia. Then you have Clemson, their only ranked win is against South Carolina, again, assuming they win this weekend. But that's the same thing for Alabama and Ole Miss. So I don't really know if that, to me, it's not clear that Clemson should be ahead of Alabama and Ole Miss. I think there's a lot of recency because the Alabama and Ole Miss just recently lost the game this past weekend. So that was a little bit surprising to me. And I think it's going to be just a general theme that the ACC seems a little bit overranked in these rankings. So if we just keep moving forward here. So Boise at 11. Great to see Boise slip now into the actual rankings. Not getting into the playoff bracket because of the conference championship. They're actually now at number 11, which I think will help, particularly if when they get compared to the Big 12 champion. Then you have Indiana at 10, so they're down 5 spots after that loss to Ohio State. Definitely a close game early on. I was watching the game with friends, and I remember turning to them and saying, I think Indiana's still going to lose this game, but if they played again, I would I would expect it to be still like a close game. Now, the game ended up getting away from them, and they ended up losing by 23, but I think the point is if Indiana played Ohio State again, I'd probably, if they were laying the 23, or they were getting the 23 points, I'd probably take them to cover. So Indiana, a decent showing against Ohio State. They still had a little bit, or I guess a few issues, particularly that they, after that 70-yard drive to start the game, they only had 80 more yards of offense the rest of the game. So, but Indiana looks firmly in. They're going to be playing Purdue this weekend. I'd be very surprised if Purdue was able to beat them. So they look like they're firmly in. Then we get to the interesting part of the rankings. So you have SMU at 9, up 4 spots in the rankings. SMU, a one-loss team. Their only loss came to BYU. So they're at number 9. Then you have Tennessee at 8, up 3 spots. Georgia at 7, up 3 spots. Then Miami at 6, they're up 2 spots. Then you have Notre Dame at 5. They're up 1 spot. They're taking over for that Indiana loss. That Indiana spot, and then Penn State at 4, and the rest of the top 4 is unchanged. So Penn State at 4, Texas at 3, Ohio State at 2, and Oregon at 1. Now, the key points I want to touch on with the top 10 is, let's start with the ACC. So the ACC is positioned really nicely to get 2 teams into the playoff. So right now, Miami and SMU have the inside position to get to the ACC championship. If both those two, SMU is actually in it already. They're already clinched. If Miami beats Syracuse, they will get in. If they lose, and if they lose, Clemson will be in, regardless of the Clemson South Carolina game. So let's assume that Miami and SMU both win this weekend. They will both be ranked in the top 9 presumably next week, and then you're in a situation where, can you really get knocked out of the playoff for playing a conference championship and losing? Now, reading the tea leaves of what the committee is saying, the one thing they said tonight was they hold conference championship teams, or teams that play in the conference championship, in high regard. And there's a general narrative out there that you shouldn't be able to be knocked out of the playoff because of a conference championship loss. Now, I think it's a tough balance here, and I think it actually needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, because let's take the SEC, for example, and Lane Kiffin was complaining about this before they ended up losing to Florida and knocking themselves out, but the SEC, making it to the SEC championship game, that is a lot different than making it to the ACC championship game. And I think when you say that making it to the conference championship is an accomplishment, and it shouldn't be held against you, I think that assumes all conference championships are the same, and I don't think they are. If you look at what Georgia had to face to get to the SEC championship, a lot different than what SMU or Miami had to face, and particularly when you look at Miami, this is a team that has looked shaky in a lot of games that they've played a lot of teams close, have a fantastic offense that could potentially outscore every single team in the playoff here, but they're a team that is getting a lot of the benefit of the doubt. Should they even be ranked ahead of SMU? It's not really clear to me. I'm not really sure what Miami's big win of the year was. In fact, what I remember more about Miami is the fact that they actually really have 3 losses. They have 1 loss to Georgia, which is actually in the standings, and then you have 2 losses. One to Cal, in which they were bailed out for a missed targeting call in the last 2 minutes of the game, which was a clear targeting. It got reviewed, and somehow it wasn't overturned. And then you have the Virginia Tech loss, in which they called, they ended up overturning the call, and then there was a video review, and the wrong call ended up being made at the end of the game, where Virginia Tech almost completed a Hail Mary. So the point is that Miami's been lucky with some of these end of game reviews, and there's the conspiracy theories out there that you can just go look at on your own time. But I think the committee should take into account how you win some of these games, just like they take into account how you lose. I mean, it's clear that they're taking into account how Penn State lost to Ohio State versus, say, Indiana. So they should take into account how you win some of these games. So I think the ACC is ranked a little bit too high, and I think this is a real question. Should a 2-loss ACC team get in above a 3-loss SEC team? And when you think about the comparative strength of schedule, strength of records, even when people talk about the eye test, it's not clear to me that some of these ACC teams being considered are better teams than these SEC teams. So that's on the ACC. And then the other point is on Georgia. So I thought Georgia was going to be ranked somewhere in the 3 to 6 spot. I thought 3 was a little bit aspirational. But my view is that Georgia, because of the Ole Miss and Alabama losses over the weekend, that have now kind of freed up the committee to rank Georgia, more in comparison to these one-loss teams. I thought Georgia had a decent chance of being ranked above Texas, especially particularly because of the win at Texas by convincing margin. Instead, Georgia gets ranked at 7, which the reason I said 3 to 6 is because I thought in the downside case they would still be ranked up against ahead of Miami. For them to be ranked behind Miami is still very shocking to me. But Georgia ranked at 7. I think they should probably be ranked ahead of Miami, and I think you can make the case that they should be ranked ahead of Notre Dame and Penn State, though I think that's maybe a little bit tougher case to make. But definitely worth debating. And the key reason this is important is because where Georgia is right now is they would be the 8th ranked team in the playoff bracket. And if they, assuming they win, well, first they would have to play Tennessee, which is not an easy game, but that's what the 8 seed brings, 8 versus 9. And then if they win, they'd have to go play the number 1 seed. So you have to go play Oregon, Ohio State. That compares to say Notre Dame or Penn State, who let's just talk about Notre Dame, because I think there is an interesting argument they should be ranked ahead of Penn State. So if you look at Notre Dame has a really, really bad loss earlier in the year. It's clear the team has completely changed from that loss. That loss, they lose 14-13 to NIU. So the defense really hasn't changed much. They just continually hold teams to less than 21 points. But the offense has really come alive after the NIU game, and they're scoring a ton of points. They're scoring 50-plus points in a bunch of these games, or somewhere in the 40s. So the team is completely different. And they also have that big ranked win against Texas A&M on the road, first game of the year, night game, again at A&M. Now that compares to Penn State, who is getting a lot of credit for losing a very close game to the number 2 ranked team in the country. And I guess they have this top 25 win against Illinois. But other than that, they really haven't been that impressive. Now, I really hope with this common opponent that Notre Dame's playing this weekend in USC, that if Notre Dame, looks dominant in that game, or even just controls the game and wins, just say by 10 points, I think it ranked above Penn State, because both will be one-loss teams, and they'll have a common opponent. And you can use that performance against a common opponent to help rank or help decide how to rank those two teams. And the reason, again, it's important, now coming back to tying Georgia back into this, is the way this is set up right now is that the Big Ten loser, so Oregon and Ohio State, the team that loses that game is going to be ranked 5. Now, you want to be ranked 5 because most likely you're going to be playing Boise in the second round, which because Boise would be ranked 4. And then, you beat Boise. It's an easy path to get to the semifinals. Now, that would be the Big Ten championship loser. So now you get to Penn State. So Penn State's ranked 4 in the rankings, but they would actually be ranked 6th in the playoff seeding because of the buys that you get as a conference champion. So they'd be ranked 6th. Now, you win that game, you are playing likely Miami or SMU, the ACC champion, in that next round game. Again, a lot easier than, let's say, if you are ranked, instead of being ranked 6, you're actually ranked 7. Now you're ranked 7. Who are you playing if you win your first round playoff game? Now you're going to play Texas, or you're playing Georgia. You're playing the SEC champion. That is a big difference in terms of getting to the semifinal than playing, the ACC champion or Boise State. So the seeding in this 4, 5, 6, 7 range is actually really important. And everyone keeps, you're just going to host a home playoff game. That's awesome. But the seeding is very important because it really determines who you get to go play next in the second round, because there is no reseeding after the first round playoff games. So, if I'm Notre Dame, I'm really paying attention to how we get seeded relative to Penn State next week. and the USC game should be really impactful in helping make that decision. And then similarly for Georgia right now ranked number 7. They would be seeded number 8 in the playoff bracket. They would of course be arguing for a better ranking than just say a Notre Dame or a Penn State, which if they got that, that put them more in that 6 to 7 range, where they'd be playing, the ACC champion, which is again a spot where you want to be. Now, if you are an at-large team, what are you looking for this weekend? So if you're Alabama, if you're Ole Miss, if you're South Carolina or Clemson, you're looking for a Tennessee loss. You're looking for an Indiana loss. You're looking for SMU to lose. You're looking for Miami to lose. So Tennessee is playing Vanderbilt, a really tough team that's been playing all these SEC teams close. They just lost over the weekend to LSU by 1 score. So definitely going to be a tough game against Tennessee. And Tennessee is just not one of those teams that actually blows SEC teams out. They have their offense has been, the quarterback hasn't been that impressive in these SEC games. The running game has really carried them, and Tennessee's defense is really strong. So you're seeing a lot of these low scoring, very 1 touchdown-ish type games for Tennessee. 7 to 10 points. Then you have Indiana playing Purdue. They should win that game. SMU is playing Cal. Cal is a team that plays people close. Had a really promising start to the year. Has lost a couple games as of recently, but not a team to write off in terms of potentially pulling an upset. SMU though playing really good over the last couple games. And then you have Miami. Miami playing Syracuse, 2 of the top passing teams in the country. Miami is favored by I think 11 right now. So not like people expect it to be a huge Miami win, but Syracuse is a team that, and they're playing at Syracuse. So Syracuse is a team that hopefully, I think just to clear up some of this ACC, what I think is overranking, hopefully clears some of this up. But the reason you want SMU or Miami to lose is because a second loss heading into the ACC championship really complicates things, which is when you complicate things that will lean in favor of some of these bubble teams. An SMU loss, a Miami loss will put those further back, and then you have the ACC now being unquestioned, only getting 1 team in the playoff, which would be the automatic qualifier. So I'm really looking at that game, and then, those games, and then the last game I would just highlight, which again we will hopefully preview either on Friday or Saturday morning, is this A&M Texas game. A game that's been circled on the calendar since the start of the year. Tickets have been $500 plus since August and haven't really dropped at all. People are really fired up for that game. It's going to be a night game at Texas A&M, so it's really going to be a really wild atmosphere. And the winner of that game gets to play Georgia in the SEC championship. So really excited to see that one. The other note I would just make on the rankings, I thought it was a little inconsistent for the committee chairman to say they're not afraid of ranking 3 lost teams above 2 lost teams. I think that's just wildly inconsistent because they have Clemson with 2 losses ahead of Alabama and Ole Miss, despite what I think is not deserving. Interesting point that one of the analysts made on Georgia now playing Georgia Tech this weekend, which would be a common opponent versus Miami, where Miami lost to Georgia Tech. So that will be, and the reason that's important is because if Georgia wins the SEC, they would hope that, and Miami won the ACC, Georgia would want to make the argument that they're the second-ranked team in the country for the playoff bracket rather than the third-ranked team, which would be decided between the ACC and the SEC champ. And I think that's it. I think the committee. Oh, and the last thing is the committee is. This is again another point that you always need to look at for the committee rankings, but it's particularly more important this year, where you have it's not just an undefeated or a 1-loss team. Is the balance between looking at teams throughout the year versus taking a team that's playing good football as of recently. Tulane's a good example of this. I think. So Tulane's a good example, who's now ranked 17, despite having 2 losses earlier in the year to Power 4 opponents, and kind of Georgia, where they ranked, how they played recently is another point to look at. And then also I think who some of these teams have lost to. So Alabama has lost to Oklahoma, which we'll see how Oklahoma plays against LSU. But is Oklahoma maybe a team that's finishing the year really hot? And that one's a little bit more iffy. I think the Ole Miss loss to Florida. People have really looked at Florida as the team from the first half of the season, but this Florida team recently has really come alive. Really, since that they got blown out by Texas, and they played Georgia really tough. I mean, they were tied. I think they were tied. Yeah, they were maybe tied or down by a little bit to Georgia when their quarterback got hurt. Ended up losing to Georgia by 2 touchdowns, but still, close game until the starter got hurt. They beat LSU, and then they just go beat Ole Miss. So this is a team that really, it's not like the first half Florida team where everyone's saying, oh, well, Miami really blew out Florida. They had no problem playing an SEC team on the road. Yeah, that was the first game of the year. Wasn't a night game. Though I guess Ole Miss didn't really play a night game either this past weekend. But a little bit different. First game of the year. And the Florida. I mean, they just had a completely different starting quarterback, and the team has improved and is not the same team that they were in week 1. So how do you kind of adjust for teams changing throughout the year? I think that'll be an interesting question, something the committee will have to grapple with. And anytime you hear balance, just remember that balance leaves the door open enough for the committee to make decisions that they feel are more expedient for them rather than the actual right decision or the consistent decision. So you'll hear something like looking at teams more recently. When it suits the committee, you'll hear looking at teams' body work throughout the season when it suits the committee more for their explanation. So just keep yourself attuned to that. But in the meantime, a lot to get excited about for this weekend. I was actually a little bit pessimistic on rivalry weekend maybe a week or two ago, but we're really shaping up to actually have some pretty good matchups with Texas A&M, Arizona State playing for a chance to get into the conference championship. The Big 12 has a lot of really interesting matchups this weekend. And then you have that Clemson, South Carolina game, which will be an exciting one at 12 on Saturday. So a lot of games to look forward to. We'll be previewing those probably on Friday. And in the meantime, hopefully this was helpful, and we'll connect again later this week.